Welcome, everybody. I hope you can hear me. My name is Sabine Burnaby. I'm the head of evaluation at the European Investment Bank, and I am delighted to chair this session, which addresses the very important topic of climate finance. As we all know, this coming decade is really a critical one for climate action, and urgent action is needed to address the planet's climate and environmental crisis. And together, we must work together to fight global warming, but also to adapt to the unavoidable impacts of climate change. And addressing these challenges requires significant investment, both in terms of scaling up volumes of investment for climate finance, both public and private, but also mobilizing different types of financial resources to respond to the different needs in country contexts, including grants, loans, equity financing, guarantees, and so on, and also working together to deliver this support through multiple channels, including multilateral development banks, international financial institutions, bilateral agencies, global funds, and private financiers. So of course, mobilizing financial resources is not the only part of the story. It is also important to ensure that this climate finance is achieving results and that it's being delivered efficiently in order to fight both mitigation and adaptation. So how are we as evaluators contributing to this global effort? First, of course, we bring credible and impartial evidence to decision makers, excuse me, on what works and what doesn't, both in terms of the activities to combat climate change, but also in terms of the financing. And this is important at a time when innovative approaches are needed on both those fronts. And we're also, of course, as evaluators, reporting on results and ensuring transparency and accountability of our institutions, which builds trust in the systems and helps to mobilize further finance. So we have a great panel assembled here today to discuss these issues. It is my pleasure to introduce Andreas Reumann, the head ad interim of the Independent Evaluation Unit of the Green Climate Fund, Charu Wilkinson, external consultant and team leader of the EIB's Climate Awareness Bonds evaluation, Alper Dincer, evaluation manager at the Independent Evaluation Department of the EBRD, and Heinz Rudolph, senior evaluation officer at the Independent Evaluation Group of the World Bank. Welcome, everybody. So we will start with 4 brief presentations from our panelists, who will share insights from recent work that they have led. And then the panel will exchange on their experiences of evaluating climate finance, and we will discuss more broadly how evaluation functions can achieve influence in our institutions and beyond. And then we will conclude with a 30-minute Q&A, and you're already welcome to start posting your questions at any time during the session in the Q&A box. So without further ado, I'd like to pass on to Charu to kick it off. Charu?
All right. Thank you, Sabine. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm delighted to share with you the main findings from a recent evaluation of the EIB's Green Bonds program, which are branded as Climate Awareness Bonds. This evaluation is quite interesting for several reasons. First and foremost, this evaluation looks at the funding side of things. So as Sabine mentioned, evaluations are interesting because they could look at both the activities that are financed, such as the lending activities of multilateral development banks, but also the financing side. And this particular evaluation looks exactly at that, how the EIB is raising money from the capital markets by issuing green bonds and then allocating these funds to green projects in the sectors of renewable energy, energy efficiency, clean transport, and research and development of low carbon technologies. Secondly, the evaluation covers topics such as best practices in green bonds, allocation of proceeds in both allocation reporting as well as transparency, in terms of impact reporting, external review and verification, etc., It covers the costs and benefits of issuing green bonds and how green bonds can be used to reorient capital flows to more sustainable activities. As such, the evaluation should be of interest to both policymakers as well as market players such as issuers, but also the investor community. So without further ado, I'm just going to briefly talk about the context for the evaluation and then jump straight into the findings. So most of you probably don't know that the EIB issued the world's first green bond in 2007, but a lot has changed since then. Especially at the time the evaluation was launched, there were a lot of changes taking place at the level of the market. So for example, new market standards such as the EU taxonomy and the EU green bond standard were coming on stream. And there was a lot of hype in the market. 2019 had seen a huge increase in issuance volumes, and 2020 was expected to follow suit, which was the time we launched the evaluation. There had been a huge diversification in the market following the footsteps of green bonds. New types of use of proceeds bonds were emerging, such as social and sustainability bonds. There was generally a lot of hype about ESG. In parallel, there were policy changes in the pipeline. So the EU had announced ambitious climate targets. There were new policy initiatives such as the Green Deal investment plan. The EIB itself was undergoing changes as an institution. It was transforming itself into the EU's climate bank. So against this background, the evaluation had two objectives. Firstly, to examine the role of the EIB in contributing to the development of the green bond market between 2007 and 2020. And secondly, the evaluation reflected upon the implications of all these policy and market changes for the EIB's green bonds activity going forward. And on the next slide, please. The evaluation finds that the EIB has played a foundational role in the development of the green bond market, and there are several aspects of this key development role. So for instance, the EIB has regularly issued green bonds at scale and in multiple currencies and tenors ranging from 2 to 30 years, which has contributed to the growth and diversity of the asset class and in generating investor interest. The EIB has also made significant inputs and contributed its expertise in the development of market standards, but more broadly, market education, as well as dissemination of good practices. The evaluation found that the EIB's green bond framework exemplifies best practices in several areas, such as use of proceeds are aligned with EU legislation on sustainable finance. There's a dedicated sub-portfolio in Treasury for unallocated green bond proceeds. There's very detailed and transparent allocation and impact reporting. There are assurances by supervised external auditors, which are some of the best practices we identified. But at the same time, as always, the evaluation also identified some areas for improvement. The evaluation also identified a range of significant benefits for the bank, some of the notable ones being investor diversification, a halo effect on conventional bonds, the reputational benefits of issuing green bonds, and we also found some evidence of greenium. On balance, we find that the benefits of issuing green bonds were far more significant than any additional costs incurred by the bank in issuing green bonds, and these costs were found to be marginal. And finally, what the evaluation found is that the green bonds can play an important role in enabling the EIB to stimulate green or sustainable investments. And bearing this in mind, the evaluation made a series of recommendations that sort of encouraged the bank to capitalize on the good practices and the successes it had achieved, and to promote the virtuous cycle between issuing of green bonds and the financing of green investments. So just bearing in mind the 5-minute time limit that we have, I've kept really a short presentation providing really a headline summary of the key findings. And I hope that we will have more of a discussion on these issues later on. And for your reference, some links are included which you may find interesting, which is the full evaluation report, which is available on the EIB team's website, as well as links to the evaluation team's webpage, which has links to other evaluations from EV. So thank you for your attention. And I will now pass the floor to the next speaker, which I think is Andreas.
Thank you, Charu, for this very interesting presentation on an innovative topic, which will be important for climate finance. And yes, pass the floor on to Andreas. Thank you.
Thanks, colleagues, and thanks, Charu, for this lovely presentation. So I'm very pleased to discuss the topic of climate finance here and evaluations today here in this session. My name is Andreas. I'm coming from the Independent Evaluation Unit of the Green Climate Fund. So basically, as per mandate, the IEU, the Independent Evaluation Unit of the fund, is the accountability unit that directly informs the decision-making of the board by disseminating and synthesizing its lessons learned. So the ultimate goal of the evaluation that I'm going to present today, which is the evaluation of the GCF's private sector approach, was to help the fund to revisit some of its processes, its policies, its features, and ultimately improve the support and activities in the fight against climate change. So from an institutional perspective, I'm not quite sure if you all know, but the GCF aims to promote paradigm shifts toward low emission and climate resilient development pathways. And while doing so, it would want to take into account the needs of those developing countries, particularly vulnerable to adverse effects of climate change. So throughout this evaluation, we identified 5 core provisions that are discernible from the GCF mandate on the private sector. And these are as follows. It's basically to channel private sector finance, including catalyzing finance. It's also to pursue a very country-driven approach. It's to ensure the geographic and thematic balance between mitigation and adaptation. It's also to ensure the efficiency and effectiveness of promoting participation of private sector actors, in particular local actors. And it's also to support the enabling environment necessary to enable private sector involvements in small island and least developed countries. So my presentation is only going to focus on some of the key conclusions that we were discerning from the findings and from the evidence that we established through this evaluation, as well as letting you in on some of the key recommendations that we made to the board of the GCF. So let me get on with it. So some of these findings of this evaluation are quite startling, but also some others might be very well known and were quite expected by the receivers of this evaluation, by the board of the GCF. So now coming to those 6 conclusions that I want to present here. The first is the role of the GCF in the climate finance space. So the mandate of the GCF, as per our governing instrument, basically refers to 2 main aspects. The fund will play a key role in channeling new and additional and adequate and predictable financial resources, as well as, secondly, catalyze climate finance, both public and private, at an international and national level. So the GCF has successfully channeled new financial resources to developing countries. It has also leveraged large-scale co-funding from public and private resources. However, in the strategic documentation of the GCF, there's no clear distinction and no clear distinct differentiation between the term leveraging and catalyzing of climate finance. So the updated strategic plan uses these words, in fact, interchangeably, and overemphasizes the leveraging of climate finance by looking at the leverage ratios as the main measure of impact of private sector activities. So the fund's private sector facility to date has focused on maximizing the leveraging in individual projects, rather than looking at the qualitative, more important catalyzing of private sector for adaptation and mitigation activities. So we came to the conclusion that this distinction is very much needed and needs to be made between the 2 aspects of catalyzing as well as leveraging. So this is important because the private sector has also demonstrated a strong interest in climate finance through the surge in green bonds, and we've just heard this from Charu worldwide, as well as climate-related disclosures, so the ESG considerations, as well as investing in more climate positive investments. So the role, however, for this catalyzing falls to the public finance area, which is such as the GCF, to allow the private sector to actually do this jump. A second conclusion links to the GCF portfolio, and specifically here to the mandate to be very country-driven. So the Paris Agreement states that the GCF should ensure efficient access to climate finance in the context of national climate strategies and plans. And indeed, again, the GCF's governing instrument focuses on the pursuit of a very country-driven approach and promoting and strengthening the engagement at country level for an effective involvement of relevant institutions and stakeholders. Well, despite these mandates, the fund has very limited engagement with the national governments to align spending from private sector resources on private sector projects with a national climate agenda. We found that project orientation is driven largely by larger international accredited entities such as the UN organizations with multi-country projects, which then translates into very limited country-driven processes and stronger country ownership. So here we see there's an opportunity to link to the private sector and link the private sector to the national strategies, such as the NDCs, for instance. A third comment is on the processing of the GCF. And here, this is no surprise, the GCF as an institution is still very slow. It has improved from the early days, but there's still some room for further improvement. So it takes, for instance, it takes very long to accredit entities at the GCF with a median of 750 days. And this is generally speaking considered very long, and even longer when you're speaking about the culture of private sector investments. The same also accounts for the private sector project development. So it takes very long to get projects approved here at the fund with a median of 250 days until board approval. And that is only the first step, as it will be followed by legal negotiations thereafter. A fourth point relates to this question of the direct and indirect finance, private sector finance of mitigation and adaptation activities at national, regional, and international level. So we found that private sector projects are largely driven by UN organizations and larger MDBs, and are heavily weighted toward a few sectors, such as the energy sector. So other evaluations here at the fund and from the IEU have also found that there's very little investments in adaptation activities, which are so important for most of the developing countries in the fight against climate change. The fund has also invested very little to support the upstream enabling environment that indirectly results in private sector finance flowing to adaptation and mitigation activities. The GCF support for policy and regulatory reforms, we're talking about these enabling environments, as well as the technical capacity building and readiness, is delivered primarily with limited targeting and very little consultation of the local private sector. Coming to the fifth, next slide, please. Coming to the fifth key conclusion here, we're looking at this question of how is the GCF indeed looking at the local actors, including small and medium-sized enterprises and local financial intermediaries. So those, as we call them, MSMEs. And MSMEs are central to implementing several mitigation and adaptation actions that are commonly included in the SIDS and the LDCs, so the small island developing states, as well as the least developed countries. And they're very key for those national climate plans. So for example, sustainable fishing practices, climate smart agriculture, energy efficiency in buildings and small scale manufacturing, as an example, cook stoves, for instance. there's indeed a strong need of the involvement of small and medium-sized enterprises. So the deployment of these actions tend to require numerous small transactions in local currencies, and which is likely to be more effectively deployed by local financial intermediaries, which in turn are likely to be direct access entities for the fund. Again, we found that there are very, very few of such entities accredited. And although we have some that are accredited, almost no funding flows directly through them. And the result is that basically we found that the fund does not directly deliver on its mandate to promote participation of local actors in the private sector. The last area, the last conclusion that I'd like to show here looks at the mandate of the fund to strive to maximize impact of its funding for adaptation and mitigation, while seeking and promoting environmental and social and economic co-benefits, and taking a very gender-sensitive approach. So here, despite this mandate to balance adaptation and mitigation efforts, we found that the fund provided very little funding for adaptation projects, as I initially mentioned. And when we come to private sector projects in the SIDS and LECs, it has to a large extent focused on mitigation projects, despite the need for recognition under the UNFCCC as vulnerable to climate change. So stakeholders have recognized this challenge to financing adaptation projects as very slow, and have said that in that regard, we need to focus on the investments in enabling environments for the private sector adaptation. So now, let me turn very briefly to, next slide please, to the recommendations that we found. So given these 6 conclusions, we've got 5 recommendations that we, very high level recommendations that we brought forward to the Secretariat and the board of the GCF. So the first is on channeling of financial resources and catalyzing opportunities. So the IU recommends to the board and to the Secretariat to clarify that the GCF is a high-risk fund that aims to catalyze investments in transformative adaptation and mitigation projects, rather than only looking at high leverage funds that aims at maximizing the quantity of co-investments. So this could be done through strategically determining private sector actors and adopting appropriate modalities for the engagement, or determining ambitious targets for private sector engagement in all of the GCF's resource areas. Secondly, the IU recommends that the Secretariat would enhance the speed and the transparency of GCF operations to align with the culture and the private sector needs for efficiency and predictability. A second area looks at the country ownership, and here the IU recommends that the Secretariat should take measures to ensure that private sector projects are country owned, and the access to GCF should be informed by very, very country-driven approaches directed and prioritized by NDC gap analysis. That's been a main gap in the GCF's country planning. The third area looks at the directly and indirect financing of mitigation and adaptation activities. And here the IU recommends that the Secretariat should take in would be needed to ensure the structural linkages between private sector priorities and the public sector projects. The fourth area really looks at the participation of private sector. And here I've mentioned that before, we really feel that there should be a stronger priority set on the channeling of finance through medium and small size, micro and small size enterprises. And finally, the enabling environment of private sector, in particular in vulnerable groups and vulnerable countries such as the SIDS and LDCs. And here we recommend that the GCF board and Secretariat should expand on the focus of financial instruments and GCF support that would specifically enable private sector investments in adaptation in those countries. And here we feel that the GCF has the opportunity in looking into this more, as it has quite an array of financial instruments available in its arsenal for such activities and engagement. So I'll stop here, and I'll be really looking forward to our discussions later on about the evaluations and what we learned in terms of how to inform decision making at the highest level. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Andreas. I hope everybody can hear me. I'm having some technical issues. So let me just, in view of the time, let me pass straight on to Heinz then from IEG of the World Bank. Heinz, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you for this invitation. I was planning to focus on two evaluations that the independent evaluation group have done. One was about the carbon finance, and the second one was about renewable energies. But for the sake of time, I'm just going to spend most of my time on the carbon finance part. But first of all, as a background, the independent evaluation group evaluates the World Bank Group, which has three institutions: the World Bank, the IFC, and the MIGA. And we try to reflect we try to evaluate all these three institutions at the same time. And this is, for example, the case of the first evaluation about carbon finance. It was conducted in 2018. We have several evaluations in the area of climate. Carbon finance one, the energy efficiency, it is ongoing. We have another evaluation going about the role of the private sector the role of the World Bank in enabling private sector participation in climate finance. And we have this other one in renewables. The reason I chose these two, carbon finance and renewable energy, said that the first evaluation was very well taken by the World Bank Group and management in general, while the second one was much more controversial, but I think it having quite a lot of impact on what's coming after. And I think that could be useful for our discussion coming forward. So going into the carbon market, carbon finance basically use market-based instruments to generate emission credits through instruments in low carbon projects and emissions reducing activities. So we evaluate as an independent evaluation group the role that the World Bank played in this area. The main findings was first that the World Bank group responded to global needs, adapting to market and regulatory changes, yet fragmented. What happened here is 1997 with the Kyoto Agreement launched the concept of carbon finance, and basically the World Bank started warming up and developing this market. And when the Kyoto Agreement kicks off in 2005, the methodologies, the instruments were already there, and the World Bank, helped to create this market. So the World Bank catalyzed and developed markets for climate mitigation. But as we all know, after the global financial crisis, there was an oversupply of instruments. Demand was low. There was oversupply of instruments, and this market collapsed. The lessons that we are bringing here in these evaluations are much more relevant these days, especially in the context of the kicking off of the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. The World Bank supported projects reducing emissions. And in fact, during this period of time, 2005, 2012, there were quite a lot of reductions in emissions as a consequence of these instruments. They say, well, this equivalent to taking out of the market 45 million cars. So it's a substantive amount of instruments and the impact that it has on reducing emissions. What we also found is that the World Bank Group was less effective in generating local co-benefits for sustainable development. but with using these products. What happened? Typically, most of these co-benefits were allocated into middle income and middle high income countries. Low income countries had that low representation. There were also less representation of sectors such as agriculture and urban and transport. So that was something that needed to be considered. The fact that low-income countries were less represented, it is when they start taking in the global financial crisis came, and they didn't have much opportunity to take advantage of these instruments. The World Bank Group was largely effective in innovating carbon finance and in building capacity to its clients. I think that achievement was remarkable in bringing in clients. It takes time, and I think there was quite a lot of innovation during that period of time. And it was also quite effective in thought leadership and convening carbon pricing. And through providing this leadership through different documents, gatherings, and influencing different stakeholders. So the key implications, it is, from our perspective, this evaluation, it's today much. They're much more important than it was in 2020. There's a need for the World Bank to better integrate carbon finance with development and climate finance. There was a sense that carbon finance work separately and not well integrated with the whole development finance instruments that the rest of the World Bank uses, and there is a need of integrating these two things. I think also there's an implication to attract and leverage private investment as a part of the strategy of maximizing finance for development. One of the good things, it is, despite the collapse of the carbon finance market, the World Bank was able to keep the expertise, and I think that's a great asset that it's building up today, and it can be used for building up on deep expertise with new technologies, new instruments in this new era post Paris Agreement and post Glasgow. There's also an implication of link mitigation with development and environmental co-benefits in order to include low-income countries and include also sectors such as agriculture and urban and transport in this process. And I think finally, it is essential to revitalize the carbon markets through innovation and new forms of partnerships. Basically, we did this evaluation in 2020 about the renewable energies. Things that came very clear there. These are much more complex. Renewable energies are much more complex than it is thought, and I think it was eye-opener for the board of the bank and for in general the community that thought that, well, this is just about putting a solar panels farms somewhere, and then you're going to get something. So it report really helped to say, well, the struggles that the World Bank had in investing and in developing these instruments. So what is work? Basically doing the right things. The quality of the contributions depend on project design, due diligence, screening, appraisal, structuring, implementations, including monetary evaluations, and doing the right things, which is the World Bank core contributions were in helping to remove barriers to renewable energies. And we we highlight here several barriers, including regulatory policies, integrating the renewable energies into the power system. But one thing there are a couple of things that were very key issues that open up discussions coming forward. It was significant investment risks that we found in this evaluation, and second, the constraints in mobilizing finance, especially in small and medium income countries. So these two issues are key today, and I think it's helping up to think more about what needs to be done in order to continue private sector participation in order to foster more private sector participation in the area of renewable energies. So the main recommendations coming out of this, it is the World Bank group needs to prioritize interventions that focus on integrating renewable energy sources into power systems of client countries to facilitate progress in their clean energy transitions. And the World Bank should support renewable energy scale up through comprehensive long-term country engagements with coordinated World Bank solutions based on comparative advantage of each institution, meaning World Bank, IFC, and Amiga, to address barriers aided by robust upstream diagnostics. These long-term engagements are the ones that have been much more successful rather than participating and doing spot transactions, spot operations in one country or another. And one thing that we became very clear and it was well received. It was controversial, I would say, in the management was the skills of the staff, and basically the independent evaluation group made the case to the need of continually upgrade the pool of specialized skills to help countries, to help clients address their pressing and rapidly evolved challenges to scale up renewable energies. Let me stop here, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Heinz. And let me pass over to Alper. If I could ask Alper to try to keep your presentation to under 5 minutes so that we can have time for a interesting and fruitful panel discussion. Thank you.
So my name is Alper Dincer. I'm a principal evaluator at the Independent Evaluation Department of European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. First of all, I would like to thank organizers of the Asian Evaluation Week, and also I would like to thank EIB for organizing this very important panel, giving us this platform to speak about this very important issue. Yeah. So basically, it is Heinz briefly mentioned about Paris Agreement in his intervention. So this is also what we have looked at in our synthesis report, where we basically screened 108 evaluations since 2010. About climate finance from MDBs. And then while we were doing that screening, we would like to understand to what extent the past activities of the IFI's MDBs are aligned with the climate objectives of the Paris Agreement. So that's what does that really mean? So it's essentially it is, do we promote as MDBs, IFIs, do we promote low greenhouse gas emissions, and do we promote activities that are that support climate resilient development? And it's with that perspective, looking at that list of evaluations, we came up with tentative answers to that question. Essentially, the Paris Agreement has, or the MDB approach to alignment to Paris Agreement has 4 main building blocks. So one is about mitigation, basically how the activities or MDBs are aligned with the objectives of the climate objectives of the Paris Agreement. And to that end, there is a joint MDB working group. They have come up with a universally aligned list. So basically, if any activity is part of that list, then these are considered as in alignment with the Paris Agreement. In terms of climate adaptation and resilience, there is no such list, but essentially all the MDBs agree that they will ask 2 main questions. The first question is the operation that we are financing, is that at physical climate risk? And the second question is that, do we propose measures to manage that physical climate risk? So here, basically, the assessment itself is qualitative. But if you are able to answer that questions yes and yes, then basically that project qualifies as being in alignment with Paris Agreement. The other two important elements of Paris alignment with Paris Agreement is climate finance and climate policy. So basically, to what extent MDB's climate finance is promoting the objectives of the Paris Agreement. To that end, MDB is this joint MDB working group. They have also established this common principles for climate finance tracking. And that these are basically the rules about what counts towards climate finance and what doesn't. And in addition to that, there are also now principles in place simply to assess policy work itself and to say whether or not they support long-term strategies at the country level and promotion of or formation and delivery of nationally delivered contributions and implementation of just transition principles. So it's essentially, if policy activities are helping countries to achieve these elements, then they are considered as policy activities that support climate work. And then finally, how climate finance should be reported. And again, it is, again, this joint MDB working group, basically what they are saying is that if what we are doing, what we are financing is in the first and the second block, that being climate finance for mitigation and climate finance for adaptation and resilience, then this will be reported as climate finance and nothing else. So basically, this is, in practice, this is what it means for MDBs to be aligned with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. And then basically, looking at that 108 evaluations that I have mentioned since 2010, MDB evaluations from independent evaluation departments, we basically ask 4 main questions. So the first one is, did the activities that we have financed and that are listed in the universally aligned list, did they really reduce GHG emissions? The second one is that, again, it is like the projects that we are basically tagging, listing as climate resilient or climate adaptation, did we really systematically identify physical climate risk in those projects? And did we really propose measures? Then the third question is, it is in 2015, after COP21, major MDBs, they made firm commitments for climate finance. World Bank Group, EBRD, ADB, EIB, all of us said that we will do X amount of financing for climate finance work. So did we deliver on that? So is it possible for us to say that, yes, EBRD really achieved that target that it set in 2015? Is there any independent evaluation on that? And then finally, in terms of reporting, has climate finance reporting been transparent? Do we have any kind of monitoring on that? Is it possible to find evaluations of what does evaluation says about the transparency and monitoring of climate finance and or other climate related work? It's what we have managed to find is that in terms of GHG emission reductions, there is only analysis about ex-ante carbon footprint methodologies. And then based on that analysis, there are half a dozen evaluations of that 108 that I've mentioned, which demonstrate that ex-ante, we should expect GHG emission reductions from by renewable energy investments, and mainly for wind. But for all the rest, for all of the other activities that are listed in the universally aligned list, there is no ex-ante analysis or ex-post GHG emission data. So related to GHG emission reductions, another important commonality that we see in the reports is that in many cases, evaluators wanted to measure ex-post GHG emission reductions. They kickstarted their own evaluations with that perspective, but they failed to do so. So also in independent evaluations, we don't see any data about ex-post GHG emission reductions. There are many reasons for that, but most of the stuff, it is related to simply not being able to monitor GHG emissions, or like errors in calculations, or not being able to put in place the correct methodology to make such measurements. About the second block that I have mentioned about climate resilience and adaptation, it is very challenging. It is very challenging to answer the question that I have raised. It is like, are we able to identify the exact physical climate risk, and are we able to measure it and then propose measures? Indeed, there are a substantial number of independent evaluations that speak about climate resilience and adaptation, but there is no systematic assessment of physical climate risk in those evaluations. Climate evaluations that are related to climate resilience, almost without exception, they are very location specific, very context specific, and the findings and recommendations and data in that evaluations that we see are very institution specific. So that type of information, it does not lend itself to generalizations. This is why it is, so right now, for instance, TCFD is working on a methodology to quantify the measurement of physical climate risk. I think adaptation of that type of methods would help us a lot also in terms of evaluation of climate resilience project. In terms of climate finance, we have seen that indeed the ball is mostly on our court as evaluators. There is a joint MDB methodology, I would say, in my opinion, relatively credible and robust methodology in place to track climate finance. And MDBs are publishing joint climate finance report. But screening independent evaluations, we do not see a report that really challenges that methodology itself, or that uses that data and gives them like an independent opinion on that. So it is, we might have missed other evaluations, but please let us know if there are evaluations looking at that. But I think it is that basically that work from MDB side, it is there since 2016. There is data, but there is no evaluation. And I think going forward, for us, it is very important to simply validate the existing methodology for climate finance tracking and reporting of it. But it is in contrast to that, in terms of policy that promotes long-term strategies, nationally determined contributions, IFI work has been systematically evaluated, and the findings are very, very positive. It is typically IFI's engagement in policy work promotes long-term development of long-term strategies and delivery of nationally determined contributions. So in that sense, I think this is a positive. It's overall policy side, although climate finance, we didn't do much, but in the policy side, there are a lot of evidence, and that's very informative about the work that is done by the MDBs on the policy front. And I think it is like the carbon finance findings are, I thought that was aligned with that. And finally, one point is that it is about transparency and data in climate finance evaluations. In the majority of the evaluations, we see a high level of concern about lack of results framework, lack of high quality data. Overall, it is, I think, maybe this was the most like the common element in that 108 evaluations that we have seen. I think it is essential for us going forward to get the data right, and simply to find alternative ways for us, for instance, to come up to measure with, let's say, ex-post GHG emissions, or find proxy indicators. Also to utilize like alternative data sources to quantify physical climate risk. This is all from my side. I also look forward to comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I think Sabine is fixing her audio. And maybe, Andreas, I see that there are a couple of questions in the chat box for you. Perhaps you could use the opportunity to address some of those questions.
Sure. So I've just, I don't know if you guys have seen the same question, but there was one question that looked at the question of data and the available relevant data and how it can be collected. I think Alper has already mentioned this to some extent. Look, from my perspective, and here I speak on behalf of the unit here at the GCF, what we felt was that there's not enough differentiation between public and private sector projects, also when it comes to results management and results tracking. So we think in particular result and impact tracking, one would have to resort to a far more flexible approach. Of course, at the same time taking into consideration that we want to have a database that is aggregable, so aggregation of data can be ensured. But so we from our perspective, we felt that a narrative approach of some of the narrative reports on impacts and changes in the enabling environment would be a good way forward for some of the catalyzing action. That is, from my front, is just one of a note to this question. Again, this is of course not a perfect solution, but that's what we felt was the easiest to come with small additional adjustments that would help the results management at the fund. To the measurement of the catalytic effects of GCF investments, that indeed is a larger conversation, but let me just make three key points here. One is, and I mentioned this before, is this question of terminology and definitions. So we found that in the strategic planning of the fund, the word mobilize, catalyze, leverage, co-finance, and additional finance, and catalyzing finance was basically used interchangeably. What this means is that we don't have a precise definition or precise differentiation between different mandates of the fund, and that is a concern. And so what we found is this lack of precision and consistency in various texts and strategic texts is a concern and leads at the end to the same concern in measurement. So we found that leverage ratios were used as the key indicator to track the flow of private sector capital to specific projects, and that is absolutely inadequate and oftentimes misleading, as it would measure the success of public climate finance in leveraging private sector capital, and it does not capture the additionality of GCF funding. And rather, the GCF is mobilizing new private sector finance for projects, and rather it is crowding in or crowding out private sector finance and that could be far more important. So we felt that this was a key gap from the components perspective, and that's the second point I'm going to make. Well, when we look at catalytic action, we took lessons from the multilateral and development funds, multilateral banks and development funds. And indeed, the literature research that we've done, literature review that we've done, underline quite heavily that critical need of focusing on enabling environments and to understand trade-offs and tensions between leveraging and catalyzing actions and their goals. So in that respect, we thought of three critical areas to support the emerge from the lessons. And one is to improve national and sector policy frameworks. So that to us is key to help catalytic action. Second, to strengthen local financial institutions. And I mentioned that in my presentation as well. Again, we think that that is a key indicator for good catalytic action. And lastly, the support of development of strong pipelines through technical assistance. Again, here relating to the technical assistance that's provided by the GCF. Again, we find that to be a good measure, a good instrument variable to talk about catalytic action of the fund vis-a-vis its catalytic action. Lastly, let me just briefly say as well on the financial instruments, because I mentioned this, that we have a large mix of financial instruments available to us here at the fund. And we found that catalyzing private sector finance involves a couple of steps to improve risk return profiles for private actors. So to this end, the climate funds employ a variety of financial instruments, including grants, loans, equity, and de-risking instruments such as loan guarantees, insurances, and foreign exchange facilities. So again, we would have to look at those financial instruments and how they are used and deployed in the different contexts of the projects. And we felt that that would be another way of looking at catalyzing finance and then through the evaluator's perspective at evaluating how far the GCF has come in truly catalyzing or truly activating that mandate of catalyzing finance. There's lots more, but I keep it at those points.
Thank you. Andreas, can you hear me now?
Yeah,
yes?
perfectly,
Good.
perfectly, Sabina.
Okay, very good. So despite the challenges, we will continue. I was thinking that given the time, perhaps we could move the discussion onto how our evaluation functions have achieved influence in our institutions. And I'd like to start with a question to Charu and to you, Andreas. So, as we've been discussing, climate action is really a priority for all of our institutions. And one of our roles as the independent evaluation functions is to really bring objective and useful evidence to our governing bodies, to managements, and also to colleagues in services in order to encourage them to take evidence-based decisions. And so, Charu and Andreas, if you could share with us, what was the follow-up to the evaluations that you led, and what factors, in your view, to discuss the factors which, in your view, contribute to the actions taken following the evaluations. Charu, do you want to start?
Right. Thanks, Sabine. So yes, so I'm pleased to say that the evaluation had some impact, which we can demonstrate. The evaluation made 5 recommendations, which were translated into an action plan, and the EIB operational services came up with a list of 16 actions, so nearly half have been implemented. And the most notable progresses have been made in terms of development of a methodology to monitor greenium relative to the conventional bonds issued by the EIB. We also made a recommendation for development of new green financing products. This has also been adopted. And the other key recommendation that has been adopted and action has been taken is the establishment of a framework to embed climate as a risk component of the EIB's lending rate. So we do see that the evaluation has made some impact. And in terms of the factors that contributed to the take-up and use and influence of the evaluation were the timing. So the evaluation, as I'd mentioned before, came at a time that the topic was receiving a lot of attention, both within the bank and also externally. It was a hot topic. We also adopted a utilization-focused approach to evaluation, which meant that we took into account the information and evidence needs of the users during all phases of the evaluation and actively engaged with them throughout the process. We also engaged with the senior management of the EIB team at several points, keeping them in the loop, listening to them. And finally, the evaluation team made a very systematic follow-up on the recommendations, including following up on individual actions that were set out. So I'll pass the floor now to Andreas for him to sort of share the GCF experience with us.
Yeah, thanks, Charu. Thanks again. And Sabina, thanks for the question. Look, from our perspective, there are 3 aspects to consider, and I'll make this really brief. It's one, the institutional aspect and the governance. Secondly, the evaluation function per se, and thirdly, the strategic planning of the fund. So I mentioned this initially. Our mandate as an independent unit is definitely to serve the board and to inform the decision making at the board. And from a governance perspective, we were very fortunate that in 2021, in May 2021, the board had approved an evaluation policy that basically describes the role of evaluation for the fund and delineates the roles and responsibilities for the different actors in evaluations. And as such, it has basically helped us to provide and to discuss evaluations in a very constructive and engaging manner. So from this perspective, we've been asked to basically provide a management action report, which is a report on the status quo of the implementation of our recommendations by the GCF, 1 year after a board decision has been taken on the evidence provided through the evaluation. So this aspect of the policy really helps us to also ensure that there is follow-up with the evaluations that we present, and that we present to the board and that are subsequently discussed at the board to inform their decision making, and also to hold accountable the parties that would be the executing arm after the evaluation's been discussed, which is usually the secretariat of the GCF. So that's one. The second one is the evaluation function itself and the role of evaluations here at the fund and that again looks at the evaluation policy. And here we described 3 functions of evaluation. So one is the accountability, of course, that we have as an accountability unit to provide independent review on the processes and the performance of the fund. But secondly, also the learning component. So what does it mean? How can we communicate our lessons learned, and how can that help to improve on different activities and different processes at the fund? And lastly, the dialogue. So it's very important for us to also get into an active dialogue with the receiving end, so with the board as well as with the secretariat, to better understand what evaluations could do. And we were really glad to say that we've looked at this question of communicating and uptake of evaluations quite heavily. So we've got a dedicated team here at DIU that will think about how to disseminate the lessons learned to the audience that we have, and not only after the evaluation is done, but from the get-go. And here I want to mention that we've used opportunities that arose as well from COVID and from post-COVID to utilize new alternative channels, in particular the virtual settings as we do right now. And we haven't done that prior to COVID, to basically inform the audiences at every step of the way of the progress and of the findings that we have with the evaluations. At the same time, just to give you an example, so for instance, we've also realized that we're now all quite tired of longer conversations online. So we used espresso sessions, 15 minutes discussions, where we just present one aspect and speak to the secretariat on that particular thing to get that dialogue going. And lastly, the strategic planning. So the GCF on its set out and in the governing instrument has declared itself to be a learning organization. So I'm very pleased, and I really applaud to my colleagues at the GCF Secretariat that there is a strong readiness to consider evaluations, and not only evaluations that we've done, but also Secretariat-led evaluations to look at possible learnings and improvements of the fund's actions. So this has been quite important, quite interesting. And here is to say that, following from our evaluation, the private sector facility here at the GCF has taken on board most of the recommendations, I believe 5 out of 9, to really look at a private sector strategy for the Secretariat to define these roles as a catalyst. And you may have seen this in recent discussions at board level. The Secretariat has also presented now its new vision to become a co-investor with its partners, rather than only the financial mechanism of the UNFCCC. So and that has also led to private sector not private sector, the PSAA, the project specific approval process, to be adopted, and partnership engagement to be actively addressed in the strategy as well. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andreas, and thank you, Charu. If I may put my EIB evaluation hat on for a minute, I fully agree, especially with this point on dialogue and consultation, also the strategic planning aspect. I can't emphasize enough how important it has been to have a dialogue with services, with management, with the board, both in planning the work program to make sure that we're evaluating topics where decisions which are going to feed into decision making, but also to bring them along in the evaluation process. We consult them at the approach stage, where we define our questions and our methods. We consult them, we present our findings, and this has really made a difference to them having an open mind and an open ear to learning and taking on board the findings. So, you know, I can only echo that. Maybe I'd like to ask just one last question to Heinz and Alper before I open the floor to some of the other questions from the audience. And this is more about achieving influence beyond our institutions. So we've just discussed achieving influence within our institutions, but of course we also aim to achieve influence beyond our institutions. And Heinz, as we know, the World Bank's independent evaluation group communicates through a wide range of media to ensure that, that evaluation work is broadly accessible. And also Alper, the Connecting the Dots piece on climate finance was developed as a learning product, but I understand that its publication was timed for the COP21 in Glasgow. And so if you could both just very quickly, in view of the time, share some lessons learned and tips on how evaluation functions can achieve influence beyond our own institutions, and maybe starting with you, Heinz, on the World Bank side. Thanks.
Thanks for the question. And, I cannot claim to have a definite answer, but I can offer some thoughts about the topic. I think first of all, the independent evaluation group it is considered a key part of the World Bank group, and all the evaluations are discussed with the board, with the management, and there's quite a lot of agreement within the World Bank group about the relevance of these evaluations. As we see in the issues of climate, evaluations are not kind of a one shot. For example, when we're evaluating climate, as I was saying before, we have series of evaluations, and sometimes we deep dive on specific topics. So that creates some sort of a connection of topics that calls the attention externally, because there's always some follow-up that we take, and we continue assessing and evaluating after we finish each of these evaluations. So the topic of climate finance, it is not like there's going to be just one evaluation and nothing else. So this continuation of evaluations is useful. So we have good ownership from the bank. We have good ownership from management. We have the relevance now, and the continuity of these evaluations. Now, within the independent evaluation group, it's quite interesting. There's support for going for outreaching, and I think there's this interest in doing this outreaching to the extent that it makes the IG and the World Bank group more relevant as well. So it's a kind of a win-win situation. There's ownership from the World Bank board on the independent evaluation group. The independent evaluation group, with all the transparency, go outside and outreach to media, and that helps to reinforce the importance of the World Bank group. I think this combination of elements, it really helping, and at the same, and finally, from the staff perspective, that typically happens that the staff jump from one evaluation to another. The staff have the time and have the resources to dedicate some time to outreaching as well, and that is part of the work that we as a staff have to conduct when we finish our evaluations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heinz. Alper, would you like to?
Yes.
To continue?
Yeah, of course. I mean, as you mentioned, it is the connecting the dots piece that is right now available in our website as well. Basically the main target for us was COP26 last year for that, and that indeed, thanks to Andreas and GCF, there was a panel there, and then our chief evaluator Veronique presented the main findings of the connecting the dots piece in that panel. And then after that, without any kind of prompting, other external parties reached out to us and then basically asked us whether or not we would like to share the findings and present them in other venues. That was OECD, later on in other evaluation conferences. So I think simply making the product itself to a wider audience as possible, simply it helps us basically to catch more fish that is available on the sea and then to communicate our message. So that in that sense, I think it helped us to reach beyond an audience which is beyond our institution, and indeed which is beyond the evaluation profession. So in that sense, we consider it as something that we managed to deliver on. But having said that, I'm basically thinking about the content I have listened to in COP26. The influential knowledge products there, they are not evaluation products. They are products from IPCC, products from UNFCCC, International Energy Agency, Climate Policy Initiative. I mean, these are and other similar institutions, and their knowledge products, indeed, they shaped thinking. And if you look at IPCC reports or UNFCCC reports, references to our own evaluation products, they are very rare. Indeed, I mean, with the exception of IEG, I didn't see any references. Again, I might be mistaken. So the theory is, if we are really keen on being influential beyond our institutions, we have to be in those publications. Our work needs to contribute to the work of IPCC or UNFCCC or Climate Policy Initiative and International Energy Agency, etc. So I think that will be challenging, obviously. But I mean, again, it is screening 108 reports. We have a lot of content, a lot of credible and robust content that indeed I believe is relevant for the work of those institutions. So that's, I think, for us, I think that's a venue to explore further. I mean, if you wish, I would like to take 2 more minutes, basically reflecting about the change at EBRD and how basically our work about climate finance in evaluation is contributing to the developments that we have internally. That's, I mean, from basic 2016, 2022, we had a series of evaluations on climate finance that's ranging from solar, energy sector strategy and wind. And then we had an availability assessment of our own results management system that also speak about how we do results framework in climate and how we measure. And later on, we had the sustainable infra evaluation. In all of those evaluations, basically, we identified critical shortcomings that were mainly related to the data issues that I have highlighted. And then in 2020, we had an internal audit report, which also highlighted those shortcomings for our climate work. And then there was interest around that point in time from shareholders. And then basically, as a result of all that culminated work, and basically also with the contribution from the internal audit report and interest from shareholders, right now at the EBRD, there are a lot of positive developments that will help us to get ex post data about climate projects. But I mean, that required a lot of collaboration within the institution. So that's why I think it is that influence itself, I think it cannot be done by evaluation by itself. I think having collaborations with other units within our institutions, that's also imperative as well. That's all.
Thank you very much, Alper, and thank you to Heinz as well. I mean, I think we have, it's very interesting and insightful ideas on how we can how we can individually work within our institutions and with other units within the institution, and also how we can work together to achieve influence. And obviously climate, I mean, in general for evaluation, but obviously climate is a very important topic that we can do that with. Now we only have 10 minutes left, and I see there are at least 2 questions from the audience, so perhaps I can pass those on. The first question I would like to pass on to Charu, actually. With the climate finance high on every institution's agenda, there's also an increased risk of greenwashing. Is there a role for evaluation functions to counter that? I think that's a very good question. Charu, what do you think?
Okay, yes, that's indeed an excellent question. I'll firstly just briefly speak about the experience from the green bonds evaluation that I did with your team, Sabine. In that particular evaluation, we did not look at the topic of greenwashing for two reasons. Firstly, in the EIB's CAB or green bond framework, the green investment activities are defined very clearly, and they focus on the clear or the dark green of the 50 shades of green on sectors such as renewable energy, energy efficiency. So they were not financing what would be today considered as transition type activities, the very green activities. And secondly, the EIB has a lot of control audit processes. So I mentioned that the green bond activity is subject to an audit by a supervised auditor. So for these two reasons, we did not look at greenwashing as part of that evaluation. But indeed, it is sort of an important topic to consider for evaluators. And perhaps more so whether institutions are financing activities of the private sector, because I think that's where a lot of these concerns regarding greenwashing are emerging from. And I was wondering if here perhaps Andreas might have some sort of something to share from the GCF experiences, and particularly the evaluation that he shared on the private sector activity.
Oh, that's a very nice handing over of this question. But yeah, so I think from our perspective, there's three things that I would think of. One is we looked at, here at the fund, we're really thinking about corporate evaluations mostly and thematic evaluation. So from the IU's perspective, we would start with that first. We're a very young organization as well. So, think of it, the fund has only been around for 5 years. The unit has only been around for 5 years as well. So we started by looking at the business model. And one of the key frameworks for the business model is obviously results management. And we've done a review in 2018 on exactly that. I led this evaluation back then. And that basically identified already a couple of things. At the time in 2018, we had more than 100 different policy items that would talk about results management and the question of how we can capture what's actually happening in the projects, because the GCF as an organization is not implementing any of its projects. It's basically implemented through entities that we trust, and the trust goes as long as results management goes. So that has been one key aspect for us to look at that business model question, and we found there's a lot of loopholes with results management, and that's hopefully been addressed now with the new integrated results management framework that we have since last year. Another evaluation we've done is the environmental and social safeguards evaluation. So we looked at the fund's setup to see what sort of standards and performance standards we have for environmental and social safeguards. And what we found here is the fund in its setup, as I said, initially it's a very young organization. We use the IFC performance standards. We're now about to launch, on the basis of the evaluation that we provided in 2019, a new set of performance standards that would look at performance standards for environmental and social safeguards from the climate perspective. And again, I think what's key here is that development evaluations are very different from climate evaluations. And I think we all agree on that when you look at climate, and this goes for environmental and social safeguards as well as for results management, we're looking at things that are very, very, very intangible, and most often not seen as outcomes and impacts immediately. So most likely also going to be seen beyond the scope of a single project in a country. So that's a key issue that we had to consider. So what we said is for the environmental and social safeguards, yes, we have to look at safeguards, but actually we should also be actively promoting co-benefits. So not only looking at how can we secure and comply with policies to ensure the safeguarding of the social aspects as well as environmental aspects, but also looking into how can we actively, with projects, contribute to positive change outside the scope of the the impact that we are after with a particular project. So let's say an energy project, a wind project, as Alper said, it's clear that we look at energy access and renewable energy, but we should also be looking at the question of, you know, social aspects such as employment and issues around noise and around resettlement of communities, as well as the environmental aspects that come with such projects, and again looking at the positive change there too. And lastly, on the private sector front, you would be surprised that when we looked at environmental and social safeguards, the standards are quite strong. So IFC standards are generally for the private sector rather than for the public sector. So they fit far better with private sector organizations and their implementation. So we found, for instance, that most of the private sector projects seem to be very actively considering these issues. Whereas, I'll be honest, the public sector projects, and here it's an artificial differentiation between private sector and public sector projects, because essentially every intervention will be, to some extent at least, will be implemented by private sector. But here we felt there were far larger concerns with regards to how do we ensure compliance, how do we ensure communication and reporting on such concerns, and how to also ensure that there is enough sufficient capacity in public sector organizations to exactly do that, and that we felt was an interesting takeaway from the private sector evaluation. I'll stop here. I have lots more, but I'll stop. I'll keep myself to this. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Andreas. So we're really running out of time. There is one more question on the chat that I would like to hand over to Alper, because I think he's the one who mentioned this, if I'm not mistaken. Very quickly, in just 1 minute, Alper. You know, you mentioned that that the evaluation functions help or collaborate with the formulation of results frameworks. Can you just give a little bit more detail on how evaluation functions can do that? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I have also seen the question in the chat box. So it is, I mean, the one thing here is that it is at the EBRD, we are an independent evaluation function. This is why we have very limited scope, if any at all, to involve with the design of the project that includes the results framework of the project. So it is, so there is this, let's say there is this institutional barriers, but we need those barriers. Now, having said that, indeed, it is possible for EBRD or for any other MDB to have like a really sharp, crisp evaluability assessment for climate projects. And that can be done at the onset of the project, before the project design. And then, I mean, evaluation departments can contribute to the design of that, let's say, evaluability checklist. And then that could be implemented. So it's that will be my very, very short answer to that question.
Thank you for being so short. So I think with the 2 minutes left, it's up to me to kind of try to wrap this up. I think we've had a very interesting discussion today. We've touched on a large number of topics, and it's difficult to kind of bring it all together, but maybe I could highlight just 3 points going forward. I think we've highlighted the importance of the timeliness. I mean, in order to achieve influence, which was ultimately the, let's say, the topic of this discussion, in order to achieve influence both inside and outside our institution, I think we've talked about the importance of timeliness and making sure that our evaluations are timed in order to bring valuable evidence to decision making. We've talked about communication, both inside and outside our institution, establishing dialogue with services, with management, with the board, but also with the public at large. And there were many very interesting ideas on how that can be done. And I think to some extent, we also talked about the importance of developing common methodologies and standards to evaluate and report on climate change so that we can have some kind of comparability and broader evidence base going forward. And I guess all of this leads me to reflect on how far evaluation functions have come in the last, 20 years. We started off as mainly accountability functions, really reporting on what was being achieved. We then progressed into more the learning side and bringing learning to our institutions. And now we're really talking about influence and dialogue and how we can actually influence decision making. And I think this is has been a very interesting discussion from this point of view as well. So thank you very much to each and every one of you and to the audience. And that's it. Thank you very much to everyone.